I keep finding that the headlines we skim in a moment of distraction rarely tell us what actually happened. They give you the sizzle of a political moment, but not the quiet mechanisms underneath, the ones that will shape your civic life long after today's excitement fades. And this European defense story, this announcement that the European Union is embarking on an historic €800 billion military rearmament program, is precisely the kind of event that looks straightforward until you pull back the curtain. Because what appears to be a tale of defense spending is really a story about how continents redefine themselves when the security guarantees they relied upon for generations begin to crack. You might have seen the headline and thought it was just another military budget, but what you missed, what most people missed, is that this is also a declaration of independence, a continental awakening dressed in the clothing of defense policy. So, let me walk you through what actually happened. The European Union has announced the largest coordinated defense investment in its history. Not a modest increase, not a symbolic gesture, but a sweeping transformation of how Europe arms itself, defends itself, and positions itself in a world where old alliances no longer feel as permanent as they once did. That alone is noteworthy. But the deeper significance lies in the fact that this decision represents a fundamental break from decades of strategic dependence on the United States, a country that for 80 years served as the ultimate guarantor of European security. For generations, the Transatlantic alliance meant that European nations could invest modestly in their own militaries, trusting that American power would fill any gaps. Yet today, Europe made a different calculation. The question for you is why? To understand that choice, you have to look at the fractures that have been forming beneath the surface of Western unity for years. These fractures were not caused by a single event or a single leader. They emerged from accumulated doubts, shifting priorities, and the slow realization that partnerships built in one era do not automatically survive into the next. For decades, Europe trusted that the United States would always prioritize the defense of its allies. That trust was not naive. It was built on shared experiences, shared values, and the institutional architecture of NATO. But trust, like any foundation, requires maintenance. And in recent years, that maintenance has been neglected. You might not follow defense policy closely, but this matters to you because the stability of the international order affects everything from the prices you pay for goods to the safety of the democracies you inhabit. When Europe decides it must arm itself because it can no longer rely on American guarantees, it is not simply adjusting a budget. It is redefining the relationships that have shaped global politics since the end of the Second World War. This is why the European decision is not simply a matter of military preference. It is the culmination of a quiet reckoning that has been building for years, a recognition that strategic autonomy cannot remain an aspiration forever. At some point, it must become reality. The €800 billion figure represents an ambition that would have seemed unimaginable just a decade ago. European nations, many of which had deliberately reduced military spending after the Cold War, are now reversing course with a speed that signals genuine alarm. This is not the behavior of nations responding to ordinary political disagreements. This is the behavior of nations preparing for a world where they must stand alone. You might be tempted to see this as a temporary adjustment, a response to a specific American administration that will be reversed when political winds shift. But institutions do not work that way. Once a continent begins building its own defense industrial base, once it commits hundreds of billions to domestic weapons production, the infrastructure created does not disappear with the next election. What we are witnessing is structural change, the kind that reshapes relationships for generations. Consider the context in which this decision was made. The war in Ukraine exposed uncomfortable truths about European military readiness. Stockpiles were inadequate. Production capacity had atrophied. Dependence on American systems was deeper than many had acknowledged. When Europe needed to support Ukraine, it discovered that it could not sustain such support without American assistance. That vulnerability concentrated minds in a way that years of diplomatic conversations never had. European leaders realized that they had outsourced not just their security, but their strategic agency. And in a world where American attention might turn elsewhere, that outsourcing had become a liability. The response we see today is an attempt to close that gap, not through rhetoric, but through industrial policy, coordinated investment, and the deliberate construction of a European defense ecosystem capable of operating independently. But closing such a gap requires more than money. It requires a transformation of political culture. For decades, many European nations, particularly Germany, had defined themselves in opposition to militarism. The memory of the Second World War created a political consensus that military power should be minimized, that security should be pursued through diplomacy and economic integration. That consensus is now shifting, not because Europeans have abandoned their commitment to peace, but because they have recognized that peace sometimes requires the capacity to defend it. This transformation is neither simple nor complete. There are still voices across Europe urging caution, warning against the dangers of militarization, questioning whether such massive investments are wise. Those voices deserve to be heard. Any healthy democracy must debate the use of force and the allocation of resources. But the direction of travel is clear. Europe is arming itself in ways it has not done since the Cold War. And this time, the weapons are meant to be European. What makes this moment different from previous defense initiatives is the explicit decision to prioritize European manufacturers over American ones. The so-called Buy European clause represents a deliberate choice to exclude American defense contractors from major procurement decisions. This is not an incidental outcome. It is the stated policy. For American companies that have long dominated European defense markets, this represents a significant loss. For European companies, it represents an opportunity they have sought for decades. And for the broader transatlantic relationship, it represents a fissure that will be difficult to repair. You may not think of defense contracts as matters of civic concern, but they shape the industrial capacity of nations. They determine which countries can produce advanced weapon systems and which must purchase them from others. They influence employment, technological development, and strategic independence. When Europe decides that it will build its own weapons rather than buy American ones, it is making a statement about sovereignty that extends far beyond military affairs. The roots of this transformation reach back further than most headlines suggest. To understand why Europe is arming itself now, you must understand the doubts that have been accumulating for nearly a decade. Those doubts did not begin with any single crisis. They began with questions, quiet at first, about whether the Transatlantic Alliance could survive the political changes reshaping the United States. When Donald Trump first campaigned for the presidency in 2016, he introduced rhetoric that European leaders had never heard from an American president. He questioned the value of NATO. He suggested that American protection was conditional on European nations paying more for their own defense. He described allies not as partners in a shared mission, but as clients who had been taking advantage of American generosity. At the time, many dismissed this as campaign rhetoric. Surely, they reasoned, the institutions were stronger than any individual. Surely the alliance that had survived decades of Cold War tension could survive a few uncomfortable speeches. But rhetoric has consequences, and when those words came from the leader of the world's most powerful military, European capitals began to listen differently. The first Trump administration did not withdraw from NATO, but it planted seeds of doubt that never fully disappeared. European leaders began to ask themselves what would happen if American commitment wavered further. They began to contemplate scenarios that had previously seemed unthinkable. Those contemplations accelerated dramatically when Trump returned to political prominence and began his second campaign. His statements became more explicit. He suggested that he would encourage Russia to do whatever it wanted to NATO members who had not met spending targets. He questioned whether the United States should defend allies who were not paying their fair share. For European strategists, these were not abstract provocations. They were warnings that the security architecture they had relied upon for generations might not survive another American political transition, and so they began to prepare. The European Rearmament Plan announced in 2025 is the direct result of those preparations. It is not a reaction to a single statement or a single election. It is the culmination of years of contingency planning, industrial assessment, and political negotiation. European leaders decided that they could no longer afford to assume American protection would always be available. This brings us to one of the most significant aspects of this transformation, the role of Germany. For 80 years, Germany defined itself as a nation that had renounced military power. The Constitution was interpreted to limit military action. Defense spending was kept deliberately low. The very idea of German military strength was treated with suspicion, both domestically and by neighbors who remembered the devastation of the 20th century. That identity is now changing before our eyes. Germany has announced the largest military investment in its modern history. The Zeitenwende, or turning point, declared by Chancellor Olaf Scholz in 2022, has evolved from a rhetorical gesture into a concrete industrial program. Germany is rebuilding its military from the ground up. This transformation is extraordinary not just in scale, but in symbolism. A nation that deliberately constrained itself for generations is now positioning itself as the engine of European defense. German tanks, German aircraft, German naval vessels are being produced not just for German forces, but for export across the continent. You might not appreciate how remarkable this is unless you understand the weight of German history. For decades, German leaders avoided even discussing military matters in assertive terms. The culture of restraint was so deeply embedded that increases in defense spending were politically difficult even when they were strategically necessary. What changed was not German values, but German perception of risk. When European leaders looked at the war in Ukraine and the uncertainty emanating from Washington, they concluded that restraint had become a luxury they could no longer afford. Germany's transformation matters not only for Germany, but for all of Europe. As the continent's largest economy, Germany has the industrial capacity to anchor a European defense base. Without German participation, European strategic autonomy remains aspirational. With German participation, it becomes achievable. But German rearmament also raises questions that have not been fully answered. How will smaller European nations respond to a more militarily powerful Germany? How will the balance of influence within the European Union shift when one nation dominates defense production? These are sensitive questions that European leaders prefer not to discuss publicly, but they hover beneath the surface of every announcement. France, which has long maintained its own defense industrial base and nuclear deterrent, watches German rearmament with a mixture of enthusiasm and caution. Franco-German cooperation is essential for European strategic autonomy, but it also requires managing egos and national interests that do not always align. The joint defense initiatives emerging from Paris and Berlin represent an attempt to channel these energies productively. France brings nuclear capability, defense industrial expertise, and a tradition of strategic independence. Germany brings economic power, manufacturing capacity, and a newfound willingness to invest. Together, they form the core of what European defense could become. But cooperation is never automatic. It requires constant negotiation, compromise, and the subordination of national interests to collective goals. Whether France and Germany can sustain such cooperation over the decades required to build genuine strategic autonomy remains an open question. What is not in question is the direction of travel. Both nations have committed to building a European defense ecosystem that does not depend on American participation. Both have accepted that this will require sacrifices, investments, and political courage that were not demanded of previous generations. For the citizens of these nations, this transformation carries real costs. Defense spending that increases dramatically must be funded somehow. Either taxes rise, other spending falls, or debt accumulates. European citizens who grew accustomed to modest defense budgets and generous social programs face choices their parents and grandparents did not have to make. This is where the civic dimension becomes impossible to ignore. When a nation arms itself, it is asking its citizens to fund that armament. It is asking young people to consider military service. It is asking communities to host bases, factories, and training facilities. It is asking everyone to accept that the world has become more dangerous and that safety now requires preparation. These are not abstract policy debates. They are questions about national identity, civic responsibility, and the kind of society citizens want to build. The European Rearmament Plan forces these questions into the open. For the first time in decades, European citizens are being asked to fund their own defense at levels that will reshape public budgets for a generation. The most striking element of Europe's new defense strategy is not the amount of money being spent, it is where that money is going. The decision to prioritize European manufacturers over American ones represents a fundamental reordering of transatlantic economic relationships. For decades, American defense contractors dominated European markets. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman supplied everything from fighter jets to missile systems to surveillance equipment. European nations purchased American weapons not only because they were often technologically superior, but because doing so reinforced the political bonds of the Atlantic Alliance. Those bonds are now being deliberately loosened. The Buy European clause inserted into the new defense framework explicitly favors European manufacturers and procurement decisions. When European governments spend these hundreds of billions on new weapons systems, the contracts will go primarily to companies based in France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and other member states. For American defense companies, this represents a potential loss of tens of billions in revenue over the coming decades. For European companies, it represents a windfall that will accelerate their growth and technological development. But this is about more than corporate profits. It is about strategic independence. When a nation purchases weapons from a foreign supplier, it creates dependencies that extend far beyond the initial transaction. Spare parts must be sourced from the original manufacturer. Software updates must be authorized. Training must be provided, and in moments of crisis, the supplying nation holds leverage over the purchasing nation. European leaders have grown uncomfortable with these dependencies. They have watched the United States use economic leverage in ways that made them question whether such dependencies were wise. And they have concluded that true strategic autonomy requires the ability to produce weapons domestically. The implications extend beyond defense into the broader realm of industrial policy. Defense spending has historically been a powerful driver of technological innovation. The Internet, GPS, and countless other technologies emerge from military research programs. When Europe invests hundreds of billions in its own defense industry, it is also investing in its technological future. This is the hidden dimension of the Buy European policy. It is not simply about tanks and missiles. It is about semiconductors, artificial intelligence, advanced materials, and the engineering talent that develops them. By channeling defense spending toward European companies, the continent is attempting to build an industrial base that can compete globally in the technologies of the future. You might be wondering how the United States is responding to this shift. The answer is complicated. On one level, American officials have long urged Europeans to spend more on defense. The criticism that European nations were not meeting their NATO commitments predates Trump by decades. From this perspective, European rearmament should be welcomed as a positive development. But there is a difference between spending more and spending elsewhere. American defense companies and their political allies are not pleased to see lucrative contracts redirected toward European competitors. The lobbying efforts to reverse or weaken the Buy European provisions have already begun. More fundamentally, the strategic implications trouble American planners. A Europe that produces its own weapons is a Europe that can pursue its own foreign policy. The leverage that comes from being the essential supplier begins to diminish when alternatives exist. This touches on the deeper question underlying the entire transformation. What kind of partner does the United States want Europe to be? For decades, the American answer was clear. Europe should be a loyal ally, contributing to American-led initiatives and deferring to American strategic judgment on major questions. The alliance worked because Europe accepted this arrangement, sometimes grudgingly but ultimately reliably. That acceptance is now fraying. European leaders are increasingly willing to disagree with American positions publicly. They are pursuing diplomatic initiatives that do not align with American preferences, and they are building the military capacity to act on those disagreements if necessary. This does not mean the Atlantic Alliance is finished. Institutions with 80 years of history do not disappear overnight. But it does mean the alliance is transforming into something different. A partnership of equals, or at least near equals, is a fundamentally different relationship than a partnership between a dominant power and its dependents. The Franco-German initiatives that are driving much of this transformation reflect a particular vision of European strategic autonomy. France has always maintained that Europe should be able to act independently in the world. Germany, historically more deferential to American leadership, has now embraced that vision. Together, they are building the infrastructure for a European defense that does not require American permission to function. Consider what this means in practical terms. European military headquarters that can plan and execute operations without NATO involvement. European satellite networks that can provide intelligence without relying on American systems. European cyber capabilities that can defend critical infrastructure independently. These are not theoretical aspirations. They are active programs with budgets, timelines, and deliverables. They represent a Europe that is preparing for a world where it cannot count on American support. You might view this as a sensible precaution or a dangerous provocation depending on your perspective. But whatever your view, you should understand that the world is changing in ways that will affect global stability for decades. The bypassing of NATO structures is perhaps the most sensitive aspect of this transformation. NATO remains the formal framework for transatlantic defense cooperation. Its integrated command structures, standardized procedures, and collective defense commitments have kept the peace in Europe for generations. But European leaders increasingly view NATO as a constraint as much as a resource. Decisions within NATO require consensus, which means American preferences carry significant weight. European initiatives outside NATO can proceed without that constraint. The development of parallel European structures is not an explicit rejection of NATO. Officially, European leaders insist that these initiatives complement rather than compete with the alliance. But the practical effect is to create alternatives, options, and capabilities that do not depend on American participation. This duplication is expensive and arguably inefficient, but efficiency is not the point. The point is autonomy. The point is ensuring that Europe has choices even if the alliance fractures or American priorities shift. For citizens on both sides of the Atlantic, these developments should prompt reflection on what alliances are for and how they must evolve to survive changing circumstances. What does this transformation mean for the transatlantic alliance that has shaped global politics since 1945? That question has no simple answer, but it deserves careful examination because the consequences will affect your life in ways you might not immediately recognize. The Atlantic Alliance was never just a military arrangement. It was an expression of shared values, shared interests, and shared memories. The nations that built NATO had just survived the most destructive war in human history. They understood that peace required institutional commitment, not just good intentions. For decades, that institutional commitment held. The alliance weathered disagreements over Vietnam, over nuclear weapons deployment, over trade disputes, and over countless other issues that could have torn it apart. It survived because both sides believed the relationship was worth preserving. What we are witnessing now is a test of whether that belief still holds. The European rearmament plan is not officially a rejection of the Atlantic Alliance. European leaders are careful to affirm their commitment to NATO even as they build alternatives to it. They insist that European strategic autonomy and transatlantic partnership can coexist. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps a Europe capable of defending itself independently will remain a loyal American ally by choice rather than necessity. Perhaps the alliance will evolve into a partnership of equals, stronger for the transformation, but perhaps not. Alliances built on dependency create different dynamics than alliances built on equivalence. When one partner can walk away without devastating consequences, the calculations change. The deference that characterized European policy toward America was partly genuine and partly practical. Remove the practical necessity and only the genuine remains. How much genuine commitment exists on either side of the Atlantic is a question that events of coming years will answer. What we can observe now is the beginning of a structural decoupling. European and American defense industries, once tightly integrated through NATO standardization, are diverging. European weapons systems will increasingly be designed without American input and manufactured without American components. This technical separation carries political implications. Interoperability, the ability of allied forces to work together seamlessly, has been a hallmark of NATO effectiveness. As European and American systems diverge, that interoperability will diminish. Joint operations will become more complicated. Combined exercises will require more adaptation. None of this makes cooperation impossible, but it makes cooperation harder. And over time, harder cooperation tends to become less cooperation. The generational dimension of this transformation also deserves attention. The leaders who built the Atlantic Alliance are gone. The generation that remembered the Second World War and the early Cold War directly has passed from the scene. Today's leaders on both sides of the Atlantic inherited an alliance they did not build and may not fully understand. For younger Europeans, American security guarantees are an abstraction, something they read about in history books rather than something they experienced as liberation or protection. Their emotional connection to the alliance is weaker than their grandparents' was. Their willingness to defer to American leadership is correspondingly diminished. For younger Americans, European defense is similarly abstract. They did not grow up fearing Soviet tanks rolling through the Fulda Gap. They do not instinctively view European security as essential to American security. And they are increasingly skeptical of foreign commitments that seem to benefit others more than themselves. These generational shifts create political space for leaders to redefine relationships that once seemed permanent. What was unthinkable to one generation becomes merely uncomfortable to the next, and then routine to the one after that. The speed of European rearmament suggests that leaders understand this generational window. They are building institutions while political support exists, knowing that such support cannot be assumed to continue indefinitely. But building institutions is only half the challenge. The other half is building purpose. A European military establishment needs a strategic doctrine, a set of principles that guides how force should be used and for what ends. NATO provided such a doctrine for decades, centered on collective defense and deterrence of Soviet and later Russian aggression. What doctrine will guide an autonomous European defense? That question has not been fully answered. Some envision a Europe focused narrowly on territorial defense, maintaining forces sufficient to deter or repel attack but avoiding entanglement in distant conflicts. This vision appeals to those who remember the costs of European colonialism and wish to avoid repeating them. Others envision a Europe capable of projecting power globally, protecting European interests wherever they are threatened, and participating in international interventions that align with European values. This vision appeals to those who believe Europe must remain a significant player on the world stage. These visions are not fully compatible. The forces required for territorial defense differ from those required for power projection. The political consensus needed to support one strategy differs from that needed to support the other. How Europe resolves this doctrinal question will shape its role in the world for generations. And that role will affect the international order that governs trade, diplomacy, and conflict resolution, the order within which your own life unfolds. The American response to European rearmament will also shape the future of global order. The United States could welcome a more capable European partner, reducing its own burdens while maintaining the alliance on new terms. Or it could view European autonomy as a threat to American influence and respond with measures designed to prevent or reverse it. Which path America chooses depends on domestic political factors that remain deeply uncertain. The same political forces that made Europe doubt American reliability continue to shape American policy, and until those forces resolve into a stable consensus, European hedging will continue. You might view this uncertainty as troubling or as an opportunity, depending on your perspective. What you cannot do is ignore it. The transatlantic relationship that has structured international politics for 80 years is evolving in real time. Where it lands will affect your safety, your economy, and your democracy. As we reach the heart of this story, I want to linger for a moment on a quieter truth beneath all the noise of spending figures, political positioning, and strategic ambition. What happened here is not simply that a continent decided to spend more on weapons. It is that a civilization chose to clarify its identity in a world where the lines between dependence and autonomy have grown impossible to ignore. Europe has long lived comfortably beneath an American security umbrella, benefiting from protection while maintaining an independent posture that never fully required self-sufficiency in the military domain. But strategic autonomy demands more than aspiration. It demands investment, sacrifice, and the willingness to say that a continent's future cannot be outsourced to a protector whose commitment has become uncertain. When European leaders announced this historic rearmament, they were responding to that emerging clarity. You might be wondering what this means for you beyond the abstract terms of geopolitics or alliance strategy. The answer is deceptively simple. Your daily life will increasingly be shaped by how Europe positions itself in the world. The stability of global trade, the management of international crises, the response to humanitarian emergencies, all of these depend on whether Europe can act as a coherent strategic power or remains fragmented and dependent. Every time you purchase goods manufactured abroad, travel internationally, or benefit from the peace that international institutions maintain, you rely on a global order that European power helps sustain. We have reached a point where that power can no longer be assumed to flow automatically from American guarantees. When a continent decides to arm itself, it is asserting something fundamental about its place in the world and its responsibilities to itself. This is why the political stability of Europe matters more today than at any point in the last generation. Companies can invest anywhere. What they cannot easily find are predictable political environments with the capacity to maintain order within their borders, contribute to order beyond them. When Europe demonstrates that it is willing to shoulder the burdens of its own defense, it sends a signal not just to potential adversaries, but to potential partners. It says that Europe is prepared to be a serious actor in international affairs, not merely a beneficiary of order maintained by others. For now, Europe projects a seriousness that appeals not just to investors but to nations seeking alternatives to both American and Chinese dominance. Yet we cannot ignore the responsibilities that accompany such ambition. A continent that builds a major military establishment is not simply acquiring equipment. It is shaping its political culture for generations. These armed forces will require recruitment training and retention programs that draw citizens into military service. They will require communities to host installations that change local economies and social dynamics. They will require democratic oversight mechanisms to ensure that military power remains subordinate to civilian authority. And as with any era of rapid change, there will be tensions. Citizens will worry about the costs, the risks, and the implications of living in a more militarized society. Governments will wrestle with how to balance security investments against social spending. These concerns are not obstacles, but guardrails. They ensure that ambition does not trample democratic accountability. Still, when we step back, we see that what unfolded here is larger than any single nation, company, or leader. It belongs to a moment in world history when continents are renegotiating their place in the international order. Some will cling to past dependencies and discover too late that the protections they relied upon have evaporated. Others will seize the opportunity to define themselves through capability rather than dependency. Europe, through a combination of necessity, foresight, and political courage, has placed itself in the latter category. It has said, perhaps more confidently than ever before, that it is prepared to defend itself without assuming American assistance will always be available. And so the European rearmament decision becomes both a symbol and a test. It symbolizes the growing recognition that Europe is not merely a geography dependent on external protection, but a civilization capable of shaping its own strategic fate. And it tests whether European institutions, political cultures, and democratic systems can sustain the weight of this new role. These are not small questions, and they should not be treated as achievements celebrated, but as responsibilities accepted. The civic implications for European citizens are profound. For the first time in generations, they are being asked to fund their own defense at levels that will require genuine sacrifice. Defense budgets that once seemed permanently modest will now compete with education, healthcare, and social services for public resources. This trade-off is the price of sovereignty. You cannot claim autonomy while expecting others to guarantee your security. And European citizens are now discovering what that means in practical terms. Some will welcome this as a long overdue correction. They will argue that Europe should have taken responsibility for its own defense decades ago, and that the current investment, however painful, is necessary and appropriate. Others will resist, arguing that the resources would be better spent on social needs and that rearmament risks inflaming tensions rather than preserving peace. Both perspectives deserve serious engagement. A democracy that cannot debate the use of force openly is not fully democratic. And these debates will shape European politics for years to come. What is certain is that the decision has been made, the trajectory has begun, and the consequences will unfold for decades, shaping not only European societies but the international order within which all of us live. As we close this conversation, I want you to reflect on the fact that security in any era is less about weapons than about choices. A continent demonstrates its strategic seriousness through the investments it makes, the institutions it builds, and the responsibilities it is willing to shoulder. America did not create Europe's need for security, but its wavering commitment illuminated the identity Europe is now beginning to claim. And in the years ahead, as geopolitical competition reshapes international relations in ways we are only beginning to grasp, the regions that thrive will be those that understand that sovereignty and responsibility must grow together. So ask yourself what kind of future you want your continent to inhabit, a future reliant on the protection of others, or one built on institutions sturdy enough to guarantee the security that makes all other freedoms possible. That question will matter long after today's headlines fade. And if you found this exploration useful, I invite you to stay engaged, to think deeply with me about the forces shaping your democracy and your place in it. Like the video, subscribe if you find value in this kind of long-form reflection, and share your thoughts so we can continue examining the world with clarity, calm, and curiosity together.